This is The Dark and Twisted. I'm your story master. Join me by the fire. Tonight's tale, Trail of Blood. Someone's breath can be stolen from them either in love or in death, Karina's grandmother used to say. A frigid chill runs up your spine, and you're caught up in a sudden whirlwind. Then you cannot breathe. Such intense, passionate feelings when it's love, but fear and horror constricting your ribcage when it's death. Sadly, Karina only experienced death's icy chill. First, when she witnessed her drunk mother push her beloved father, tragically, from the third-story balcony of her childhood home. She was only 5 years old. Then again, only hours later, when grandfather killed her mother in a rage. Karina knew what losing her breath felt like, but only wished she knew when it was because of love. Now she was alone in her childhood home at 30 years old, never married, always trying to regain her ability to breathe, it seemed. Her grandfather died in prison, and her grandmother passed away from grief a few years later. Karina grew eccentric and wary of others, and while she became rich from inheriting her family's wealth at a young age, solitude was better than losing her breath. So she chose to hide away, keeping everyone at a distance. No siblings, distant relatives, friends, or romance. Karina's only companion was Brute, a large wolf dog she found a few years ago in the woods behind her house. Brute had grown into a large, foreboding animal, his black fur unkempt and his eyes a dark brown, creating the appearance they were pitch black. He had long, spindly legs and a narrow chest. His stature was reminiscent of a hellhound, but he was more than fond of his caretaker. Karina cared for the pup, pouring on him what love she had to offer. Eventually, Brute found solace in the woods where he was found, but never strayed away from Karina's land, becoming fiercely protective of her. Every night he would curl up on her porch in front of the large, ornate door, lying guard like a watchman. Karina's palatial yet rustic family home was nestled on a mountainside, tucked away in a clearing away from prying eyes. There were no marked roads to find it, just a lonely dirt path most had no knowledge of. One day, Karina was in town to buy food when she happened to catch a glimpse of a man not 50 feet away staring at her. Karina was no rare beauty, but ugly she was not, and peering eyes were not foreign to her. She became known as the woman no man could have. She was mysterious and pleasing to the eye, but wanted nothing to do with heartbreak or drama. However, this man was different. As she glanced toward him, she felt a cold chill sweep into her lungs. At first, she recognized this feeling as death upon the wind, but shortly after experiencing no fear or suffering, realized this was different. When she would normally look away, found herself locked in a longing gaze with this strange man. He was handsome and dark, an older gentleman. She had not seen him before, and suddenly found herself gasping for breath when he approached her. Grasping her chest cautiously, Karina felt her mouth agape when he spoke. "I don't believe we have met. My name is Radix. I am visiting my mother, the widow Spencer." It took only a brief conversation for Karina to know this was love. The two walked around the town for hours and chatted fondly of their lives and shared stories. Hands grazed hands, cheeks blushed, and the rush of romance seemed to permeate the air. Radix eventually offered to escort Karina home, carrying for her the items she purchased. After their initial meeting, Karina and Radix fell madly in love, and the two were wedded within the year. The widow Spencer was found of her new daughter, but lay ill in her own home, close to the town doctor. So Karina and Radix found bliss on the mountainside, Radix tending to his mother, while Karina kept the house. Brute was weary of Radix, to Karina's surprise, and stopped coming into the open when the sun shone. Instead, he waited for Karina to go to him, or for night to fall. She would go to him in the woods and spend time petting him, feeding him, and telling him many stories, just as they used to do. Brute would still lay just outside the front door, though, protecting his savior. Brute never approached Radix, and to Karina's dismay, Radix called the hound a dreadful nuisance, for who could want Satan's beast right outside their door? And while everything started out lovely, not a few months into their marriage, Karina saw a change in Radix beyond his disdain for Brute. He grew impatient with her, no longer wanted to listen to her stories, and ignored her constant need for affection. The man who doted upon her day after day was giving way to a stern, hollow man whose eyes grew dim. His lust for Karina's attention all but died, like a flickering flame, and the obvious chase for a woman no one could have was over. He was bored and ready to move on. One fateful day, as Karina begged for her husband's affection, as had become the custom, he fell into a fit of rage and threw his hand against her face. She screamed as she fell against the wall. Not moments later, the door burst open and Brute growled menacingly at the man whose face was flush with hatred. Radix stared at the dog, and the dog locked eyes as well. Brute lunged at the man, but before Brute could deal any harm, Karina jumped between the two. Brute stood down quickly, and she told him to leave. "No, Brute. Go outside. I will handle this demon." Radix's eyes narrowed in fury, and he turned his glare toward his wife. Then, like a pistol, she slapped him hard across the face. "Get out of my fucking house," she demanded. Radix kept his face turned away, forced aside from the power of Karina's rebuttal. Surprisingly, Radix composed himself, straightened his shirt collar and suit coat, then walked out of the home, closing the door gently. Karina ran to the front window and watched until she knew for certain her husband was truly gone. Then she collapsed on her love seat in tears. This was not how love is supposed to feel, she whimpered, then fell asleep from pure exhaustion. The day gave way to night, and Karina awoke to the screech of an owl. She sat up, poised, glanced around her, and felt something strangely off. There was an eerie silence in the room, and her heart felt weak. As her eyes made their way around the front parlor, she noticed her front door open, the light of the moon creeping in. The screeching owl was heard again. She walked cautiously to the front door, fearing Radix might be in her home. She stopped just before the opening, listening fervently, trying to find a noise indicating where danger may lie. But there was nothing. She decided to sit with Brute, who would be curled up in the front of the door, guarding her. She walked a few steps further, and she felt a familiar gust of wind crawl up her spine. She clasped her hands against her mouth and nose tightly, trying not to scream out loud, and, as she was accustomed to, lost the ability to breathe. She fell to the floor, hands pounding the floorboards in anger as tears fell freely. There, in front of a wailing Karina, lay the body of Brute, mutilated and utterly destroyed. She crawled over to his lifeless, bloody body and searched helplessly for a sign of life. He was cold, and himself, his breath stolen from him. She reached to pull Brute closer out of desperation, and her fingers brushed against something small, cold and metal. She looked over in her agony, and there on the porch lay Radix's wedding ring, a symbol of his hatred for her and Brute. A ways down the mountain in the woods, idle whistling filled the night air. Radix sauntered jauntily through the trees with a hand axe. He seemed light and joyful. Blood stained his hands, and his shirt looked shredded in parts. He smiled, though wounded, and looked like a man freed from sin. As he continued through the woods toward the lights of town glowing in the distance, he suddenly came to a stop. Was that rustling, he thought? His eyes darted left and right as if to find the source of the slight noise. A few seconds later, there it was again. He was able to notice the rustling coming from directly behind him. He pivoted sternly and remained as still as he could, not wanting to make any noise himself. The forest was haunting, to say the least. Owls, crickets, wind in the branches, and stark, inky blackness of a dark night began to frighten Radix. The proud assailant became cold and jarred by the sudden appearance of two glowing red eyes in the distance. Were they eyes? Could they be insects reflecting the moonlight on iridescent wings? He pondered. As he feverishly tried to explain their existence away, they quickly dissipated, gone. They were there, then they weren't. Radix found that even more chilling than when he discovered them. He began to slowly walk away, backwards, still facing where the red eyes just were. For a few seconds of stepping slowly and cautiously, he heard nothing more. He stopped moving altogether, trying to listen once more for anything. He noticed nothing, pure silence. The owl's hoots, the cricket's chirps, and the whistling branches were now all absent. The stars seemed to dim, and blackness enveloped Radix. Then, frozen in terror, there it was, a brisk chill climbing his spine. Unfamiliar to him, he felt the individual hairs on his arms and neck stand up. His heart raced, and his throat seemed to grasp for air. Then, like a whirlwind in his lungs, he faltered for breath. He collapsed to the cold, wet ground, dropping his axe. Submissive to the woods, Radix tried to open his chest and find any air to breathe. He opened his mouth in hopes of claiming any oxygen. Finally, on all fours, like a lowly animal, Radix found a breath. But before he could feel the reprieve of sudden air, he saw two spindly legs step softly in front of his widened eyes. He felt warm breath seep onto his neck, and then heard a low growl enter his ear canals. He peered up, slowly, and was met with an image straight out of hell. As he looked up, shaking, there stood a ghostly hound with red, glowing eyes. His black, mangled fur highlighted barely by the moonlight. It was Brute, but a Brute reborn. Hell Brute. He was taller, heavier, and filled with fire. A glowing ember of Satan's wrath emanated from his slightly open jaw. Orange and red pulsating breath. Radix began to cry silently. He closed his eyes as Hellbrute clamped down on his jugular, ripping the flesh from his body, causing blood to spurt all over the hellhound. Blood rained down on the forest floor as Hellbrute watched the man bleed to death before his eyes. After Radix took his last breath, Corina's beloved friend lapped up the blood on the ground hungrily, letting streams of it fall into its dense fur. Corina, still clutching her beloved friend's corpse and only companion, found no more tears to cry. She picked herself up and tried to wipe the dried blood off her hands and face. She walked over to the wash basin, leaving the door open and the night's brisk chill to wander inside her home. She dipped her trembling hands inside the porcelain basin, cupped them together and pulled cold water up to her face. She cleaned herself the best she could and stared out the window. The moonlight comforted her somehow, and she felt a peace wash over her momentarily. Then, she heard soft clicking on the floorboards behind her. She smelled brimstone and smoke. She felt warmth in the cold night air, but she did not feel afraid. She whipped around to find Hellbrute standing tall, bloody, staring at her with red, glowing eyes. She gasped, but not out of fear, but out of the fact her breath was yet again stolen. She ran to her beloved hound and wrapped her body around his. She didn't care he looked the way he did, or smelled the way he did. She held his head in her hands, and he cooed like the puppy she once remembered. "Come to bed with me, Brute," Corina spoke lovingly. And as she walked away, her faithful friend followed close behind, leaving drops of her husband's blood in his wake.